Almost 100 days have passed since the name of Yu Menglong was officially placed into the category of closed cases. In administrative documents, his story seems to have reached its end with a disturbing speed. However, outside of the paper and far from official communiques, something very different is happening. As time moves forward, public attention does not dissolve. On the contrary, it intensifies, crosses borders, and transforms into a persistent question that refuses to disappear. In many East Asian cultures, the 100th day after a death is not just a symbolic date. It represents the moment when formal mourning concludes and the living must continue on their path, while the soul of the deceased crosses its final threshold. It is a point of definitive separation between the past and the present. However, in the case of Yu Menglong, this ritual did not mark a closure. For a significant part of the public, it was the beginning of a new stage, not of farewell, but of questioning. While authorities considered the investigation closed, spontaneous acts of commemoration began to emerge in different countries. From Taiwan to Thailand, and later in Malaysia, people who had never personally known Yu Menglong gathered to pay him tribute. These were not just about flowers, candles, or photographs. They were meetings charged with emotion, where individual memory transformed into a collective gesture. These gatherings did not demand explicit answers, but transmitted a clear message. The story was not yet complete. For years, Yu Menglong had been perceived as a discreet figure within the entertainment industry. His public image was that of a kind, reserved artist, without major scandals or controversial statements. It is precisely for this reason that his disappearance left a sense of dissonance that is difficult to ignore. How could a person associated with serenity and moderation end up enveloped in such an abrupt silence? As the days went by, social media users began to review fragments of his artistic work, public appearances, and apparently insignificant moments. Small details acquired an unexpected weight, not as conclusive evidence, but as signals that, seen in their entirety, generated unease. In the absence of broad and transparent explanations, these informative gaps became the ground where new interpretations flourished. This analysis does not pretend to offer verdicts or fuel absolute certainties. On the contrary, it seeks to examine how a collective narrative is constructed when official answers fail to satisfy the human need for understanding. Beyond the figure of Yu Menglong, this story raises a broader question. What happens when the entertainment machine, economic power, and the control of information converge, and the individual voice seems to dilute? Behind the glamour, the tributes, and the formal explanations, an inevitable question arises. What mechanisms really operate behind these silent crises? Throughout this analysis, we will explore every layer of this story, from the subtlest clues to the visible structures of power, to understand not only a particular case, but the functioning of a system that is rarely exposed in full light. The professional trajectory of Yu Menglong, observed from the outside, seemed stable and without extreme upheavals. His debut in a talent show placed him quickly on the public's radar, and his image was consolidated as that of a young, educated, and emotionally contained artist. He was not known for inflammatory statements or gestures of rebellion against the system. It is precisely because of this that his subsequent path generates a fundamental question. Why did an apparently docile and cooperative figure end up facing such a high level of professional isolation? In the entertainment industry, visibility is not just a consequence of talent. It is the result of strategic decisions, investment of resources, and above all, institutional will. For years, Yu Menglong maintained a prolonged contractual relationship with his initial agency. According to public records, he attempted to modify this relationship before its formal expiration, but failed to achieve an effective break. From that moment on, signs began to manifest that, seen in isolation, might seem like mere coincidences, but together they draw a disturbing pattern. One of the elements that aroused the most attention was the progressive reduction of his media exposure. Although he enjoyed prior recognition and a stable fan base, his presence in relevant productions decreased significantly over a prolonged period. This was not an announced retirement or a voluntary break communicated to the public. It was, rather, a silent absence, difficult to explain according to the usual parameters of the industry. In this context, small gestures began to acquire disproportionate relevance. Public appearances where his body language seemed tense, interactions with fans that were abruptly cut short, moments that, in another scenario, would have gone unnoticed. However, when observed under the hypothesis of limited autonomy, these fragments take on a new meaning. A recurring example in public analysis has been his interpretation of a widely known song. In one of his versions, some listeners perceived a minimal variation in the pronunciation of a specific line. From a strictly musical point of view, this difference can be explained by technical, stylistic, or even accidental reasons. No conclusive evidence exists demonstrating a deliberate intention. Nevertheless, what is relevant is not the certainty of the gesture, but the reaction it provoked. For a public that already perceived a climate of oppression, this minimal alteration was interpreted as a possible expression of powerlessness. Here, a key phenomenon emerges. When direct channels of communication seem closed, art becomes a symbolic space where repressed emotions seek an exit. It is not about asserting that Yu Menglong was sending coded messages, but about recognizing that the public projected a shared sensation of lack of control onto his work. The narrative was not born solely from the artist, but from the interaction between his silence and the collective anxiety of those who observed him. Another frequently cited aspect is the perception of constant surveillance. Visual testimonies show situations in which his public behavior seemed conditioned by the presence of authority figures within his team. In the entertainment industry, supervision is not unusual. Managers and assistants perform necessary logistical functions. However, the line between management and control can become blurred when the artist loses his margin of decision, even in basic gestures of human interaction. This type of scenario raises a broader question about power dynamics. An artist does not only sell his image and talent, but also his availability, his time, and in some cases, his silence. When the contractual structure is rigid and exit options are limited, the sensation of being trapped can intensify even without the need for explicit coercion. From a psychological point of view, the accumulation of these restrictions can generate a state of deep emotional wear. The impossibility of expressing disagreement, of redefining one's own direction, or of regaining control over one's personal narrative often leads to feelings of isolation. It is not necessary to assume malevolent intentions on the part of all the actors involved to recognize that the system, as it functions, can produce devastating effects on concrete individuals. The central question of this phase of the analysis is not who is guilty, but what type of environment allows a person to come to feel expendable within their own professional life. Yu Menglong was not the first artist to face contractual tensions, nor the last. However, his case has become a reference point because it clearly exposes the limits of personal autonomy in an ecosystem dominated by economic interests and opaque hierarchies. Faced with this reality, many observers wonder if the outcome could have been avoided. There is no definitive answer. What is evident is that when structures prioritize the stability of the system over human well-being, warning signs tend to dilute until it is too late. And now, the question remains open for those who observe this story from the outside. How many apparently small decisions, how many accumulated silences are necessary for a person to lose the sensation of control over their own destiny? As the official information remained unchanged, the public space began to fill with alternative interpretations. They did not arise from a single source and did not obey a centralized organization. It was an organic phenomenon. People from different countries, cultural backgrounds, and levels of proximity to the entertainment industry began to reconstruct the story of Yu Menglong from scattered fragments. This process marked the beginning of what can be described as a media avalanche. The first trigger was the symbolism of the 100th day. Instead of functioning as an emotional closure, it transformed into a catalyst. The commemoration ceremonies held in Taiwan, Thailand, and Malaysia did not have an explicit political character. There were no direct slogans or formal accusations. However, their mere existence transmitted a deep distrust toward the official narrative. When the farewell transforms into persistence, the implicit message is clear: something does not fit. Social media amplified this feeling. Videos, photographs, and testimonies began to circulate rapidly. Some were old, others recent. Many lacked full context. Despite this, they were shared thousands of times. Not because they offered definitive proof, but because they reinforced a collective intuition. In the digital logic, emotion precedes analysis and repetition replaces confirmation. Soon the debate polarized. On one side, there were those who maintained that the case should be interpreted as an individual tragedy, a product of personal pressures and complex psychological circumstances. From this point of view, excessive speculation could prove harmful and divert attention from real problems like mental health in the industry. On the other hand, a growing group emerged, considering this explanation insufficient. For them, the accumulated inconsistencies signaled the existence of deeper structural factors. This division was not only ideological but emotional. Defenders of the individual version called for caution and respect. Critics of the official narrative spoke of silences, omissions, and repeated patterns. Amidst this tension, the figure of Yu Menglong ceased to be solely an artist and became a symbol, not of a concrete theory, but of a shared sensation of vulnerability in the face of opaque systems. One of the elements that intensified the discussion was the analysis of his contractual path. The entertainment industry operates through agreements that, in many cases, grant agencies significant control over artists' careers. The allocation of projects, media exposure, and public image management depend on decisions that are rarely transparent to the public. In the case of Yu Menglong, the perception of a prolonged period of professional inactivity aroused suspicions about the possibility of deliberate marginalization. From a business point of view, reduced exposure can respond to multiple reasons: market strategies, changes in direction, or simple internal restructurings. However, when this phenomenon is repeated and coincides with failed attempts at contractual renegotiation, the interpretation changes. It is not about asserting a direct reprisal, but about pointing out how power asymmetry limits the real options of the individual. The notion of professional freezing then became a recurring term. For the public, it represented the idea that an artist can be kept in a zone of invisibility without the need for explicit breaks. It is enough to not allocate resources, to not promote projects, and to let time erode relevance. This mechanism, although legal in many contexts, raises ethical questions about the responsibility of institutions toward the people who depend on them. The media avalanche reached a new level when cases began to be compared. The mention of other artists who died in equally ambiguous circumstances did not provide additional evidence but reinforced a narrative of repetition. The logic was simple. If multiple stories present similar patterns of pressure, silence, and tragic outcomes, the problem might not reside solely with the individuals. This is where collective emotion intertwines with imagination. In the absence of complete information, the public tries to fill the gaps. Symbols, images, and coincidences acquire amplified meaning. This process does not always lead to precise conclusions but reveals an underlying truth. Distrust toward mechanisms of power is deep and persistent. In any narrative marked by uncertainty, there is a point where the available facts stop growing, but the need for understanding reaches its highest level. In the case of Yu Menglong, this point coincided with the moment when his trajectory seemed suspended in an ambiguous state. He was not completely absent, but he was not moving forward either. It was not a visible collapse, but a prolonged immobility that slowly eroded any expectation of professional recovery. This intermediate period is generally the most exhausting. From the outside, it can be interpreted as a simple strategic pause. From the inside, however, the experience is often radically different. When an artist loses the ability to decide the direction of their own work, even minor opportunities acquire a disproportionate weight. Every appearance becomes a monitored event. Every gesture a potential risk. Professional life ceases to be a space for creation and transforms into a terrain of constant silent negotiation. In this context, public perception began to shift. It was no longer just about analyzing what had happened before the outcome, but about trying to understand the emotional environment that preceded it. Observers pointed out that Yu Menglong seemed to inhabit a zone with no clear exit. Leaving the system meant disappearing completely. Staying inside meant accepting limited visibility and reduced autonomy. This structural tension is not exclusive to one individual, but it becomes particularly intense when real alternatives are scarce. The tipping point did not arrive through a concrete revelation, but through a symbolic association. During some commemoration ceremonies, his name appeared alongside those of other artists who died in circumstances that had also generated unresolved questions. No explicit causal connection was established. No new evidence was presented. However, the coincidence was enough to activate a comparison process. From an analytical point of view, this phenomenon responds to a basic human mechanism. When data is insufficient, the mind looks for patterns, not to build definitive theories, but to reduce the sensation of chaos. The repetition of elements like professional pressure, institutional silences, and abrupt endings creates the impression of an underlying structure, even if it cannot be proven with certainty. Some analysts have pointed out that this tendency to link distinct cases carries obvious risks. It can dilute the particularities of each story and shift the focus from verifiable problems to broader and less precise narratives. However, it also fulfills a social function. It allows the community to express an accumulated distrust toward systems that, by their very nature, operate with high levels of opacity. At this stage, the debate ceased to focus exclusively on Yu Menglong. His figure became a catalyst for a broader discussion on the limits of power in the entertainment industry. To what extent can a company decide the value and visibility of a person? Where does professional management end and the cancellation of individual autonomy begin? These questions do not require an immediate answer to be legitimate. Their simple formulation already indicates a crack in public trust. The absence of an expanded investigation, or at least detailed explanations, has contributed to intensifying this sensation of emptiness. For some, institutional prudence was understandable. For others, it proved insufficient. In scenarios of high emotional sensitivity, neutrality can be interpreted as indifference, and silence as a form of premature closure. This is the point of greatest narrative tension. Not because a definitive truth emerges, but because the impossibility of reaching it with the available elements becomes evident. The public remains trapped between two opposing forces. On one side, the desire to respect the limits of evidence. On the other, the persistent intuition that something essential remains hidden. Over time, the figure of Yu Menglong ceased to belong solely to the realm of entertainment. His name is no longer just associated with songs, performed roles, or carefully constructed public appearances. It has transformed into a reference point within a broader debate on the limits of power, the fragility of individual autonomy, and the human cost of systems that prioritize structural stability over personal well-being. The outcome of his story does not offer a clear resolution. There is no final moment that closes all questions, nor a document that completely dispels the doubts. What remains is a persistent sensation of incompleteness. For some, it is a reason for frustration. For others, it is an invitation to observe more carefully how environments work where visible success coexists with invisible pressures. Beyond specific interpretations, the impact of this case lies in its ability to reveal an uncomfortable reality. Fame is not synonymous with protection. Public recognition guarantees neither a voice nor control over one's own destiny. In certain structures, even those who seem to occupy privileged positions can find themselves isolated, dependent on decisions made far beyond their reach. The international public reaction demonstrates that this concern is neither local nor circumstantial. The manifestations of memory, the prolonged discussions, and the insistence on not forgetting indicate a collective need for symbolic justice. Not necessarily punishment, but recognition. Recognition that behind every public figure exists a person vulnerable to the same dynamics of pressure, silence, and wear that affect many others, albeit in a less visible way. The lesson that emerges from this story is not limited to a single name. It confronts us with an essential question about our relationship with the entertainment industry and with the narratives we consume. To what extent do we accept simplified stories because they are more comfortable? What responsibility do we have as an audience when the glow of the stage hides signs of prolonged suffering? This case also invites reflection on the culture of speed with which uncomfortable events are filed away. In an era where attention shifts easily, remembering becomes a deliberate act. Remembering not as a form of accusation, but as an exercise in consciousness. Because it is only by keeping these questions alive that one can aspire to real transformations, even if they are gradual and imperfect. The future of this story remains open. Perhaps new data will emerge, perhaps not. What seems clear is that the debate it has generated will not easily disappear. It has touched a sensitive chord related to human dignity and the limits of institutional control. In this sense, Yu Menglong is no longer just an individual case, but the symbol of a conversation that continues to develop. The final question is not exactly what happened, but what we are willing to question so that similar stories are not repeated. Silence, when it is normalized, becomes part of the problem. And sustained attention, although it does not guarantee immediate answers, remains one of the few tools available to those who refuse to accept incomplete explanations as a definitive closure.